Adrian gripped his duffel bag in one hand, his suitcase in the other, and stared at the fresh blood that covered the entire right side of the stairs that led into the metro station. It was still oozing, and the passageway was filled with the echo of the blood dripping onto the steps below it. He knew things in Paris weren't great. The once boundless capital, an important cultural centre to the rest of the world, now fallen from grace, was on the news all the time. Riots, poverty, crime. It had become a cesspool of everything bad that was possible. And of course, at the centre was Ladybug trying her best, along with Rena Rouge and Carapace. But hearing about it on the news wasn't the same as seeing it in person. Adrian rolled his lips together and carefully climbed down the left side of the stairs. It had been 3 years since he'd been in Paris. 3 long years, from 18 to 21, in Nice, trying to come to terms with what had happened. And after years of therapy, his therapist had reached one conclusion. He needed to move back to Paris. He'd agreed, and he had nowhere else to go. No one wanted him, apart from Natalie, and they did have a fashion brand to run, and after completing his business degree, it made sense, but he didn't want to do it. Even after 3 years, Adrian still hated his father. He shouldn't have a legacy. Adrian should burn Gabriel's company to the ground from the inside. But he wasn't just back to properly be the CEO. He had a lot of making up to do. Adrian knew he shouldn't have left the way he did, but he also knew he had to do it. Staying in this city, in that house, after what his father had done, would have destroyed him. And even in Nice, he still felt the effects of it. He was hounded by the press on his way to and from university every day for his first year, and even after the news had died down, his peers were just as bad. He heard their whispers in the corridors. No one would do any group assignments with him. Even the tutors were wary of having meetings with him. They all thought he was like his father. And maybe he was. The way he'd left, he knew it was nasty. Especially to Marinette. He'd thought about his girlfriend every day since leaving the city. Well, he supposed she wasn't his girlfriend anymore. It had been 3 years, and he hadn't spoken to her. Not once. Even cancelling the contract on his phone so she couldn't get to him. It was cruel of him. Adrian knew that. But he couldn't speak to her. She was Ladybug, the saviour of Paris, the embodiment of the city of love. And he had been her Count Noir, protecting the city from the court of butterflies and hawkmoth. His father. He loved Marinette so much, but thinking of her made him think of everything else that had happened. The only reason they met was because their parents had been the city's old heroes, and they eventually became a couple because of it. Marinette and Adrian, Ladybug and Count Noir. There wasn't a way to differentiate. Thinking of her made him think of everything else, the events that kept him up with constant nightmares. It wasn't easy separating it, her from everything else, but he was slowly getting there. But that didn't mean he shouldn't have said something to her. He knew he shouldn't have left without a word. Adrian knew their relationship was over, but he loved her still. He always had. "Princess!" Adrian shrieked, running across the park after Marinette on his chubby legs, and she just giggled, her pigtails bouncing. "Hurry up, Buttercup," she shouted, sprinting ahead of him, towards where Sabine and Emily were sat on a picnic blanket. Even though at 4 years old, Adrian was already taller than his best friend, she was somehow faster than him, and Marinette careened onto the blanket a few seconds before he did. "You won again, Marinette?" Emily asked with a smile as she put her book down. "Yes, Auntie Emily. Adrian's too slow." Most other little boys would have become annoyed, but Adrian just blushed, and Emily smiled. She wasn't sure if 4-year-olds could actually develop crushes, but she knew for certain her son had one on Marinette. And it was no surprise. She was the cutest thing, and she was so bubbly and bright, and according to Adrian, who talked non-stop about his best friend when they were apart, lucky things always happened when she was around. "Oh, Marinette," Sabine said, "your hair's come loose. Let me fix it for you." The little girl went over to her mother, and now she was occupied, Emily crawled over to where Adrian was sat, who was watching his friend intently. "Adrian," she whispered, and her son gave her his full attention. "Yes, Mummy? Do you think it's time?" Adrian bit his lip, then nodded, and Emily took the small velvet box out of her tote bag. "Do you think she'll like it?" Adrian whispered, his green eyes holding a hint of worry. "She'll love it, sweetheart." "Are you talking about me?" Marinette asked, and the blush came back full force on Adrian's chubby cheeks. He turned back to his best friend, giving Marinette a moment to straighten out her pink summer dress before he spoke. Princess, I got this for you. I hope you like it." Marinette took the box from Adrian, and after struggling for a moment to open it, she gasped when she saw what was inside. It was a necklace, and hanging on the pendant was a small silver and red ladybug. A ladybug, she asked, and Adrian nodded. They're lucky, and you are my lucky charm. Marinette giggled, and then she gasped as a ladybug from the grass flew to sit beside the necklace. See, Adrian said, you have to have it. Sabine smiled and took the necklace out of the box. I'll put it on for you, darling. She undid the clasp, then redid it once it was around Marinette's neck, and the little girl gently touched the pendant before she looked up at Adrian with a smile. Thank you, Buttercup, she said, then leant forwards and kissed him on the cheek. Adrian's entire face went red, and Sabine couldn't stop herself from awing, and Emily discreetly took a photo of them with her phone. You're welcome, he said, then shuffled so he was sat closer to Marinette. Come on, you two, Emily said. Nap time. You can have ice cream when you wake up. With that promise, the two children laid down side by side on the picnic blankets, and then Emily took another blanket out of her tote bag and covered them up. Marinette fell asleep first, but Adrian stayed awake for a few more moments. His princess was so pretty, and in 2 weeks they'd be starting school together. He'd get to be with her every single day for a whole year. He couldn't wait. Gently, so he wouldn't wake her up, he found her hand underneath the blankets, and only then did he close his eyes. He wanted to be with his princess for forever. Marinette had always worn that necklace, every day, and even though he loved that she wore it, it was a painful reminder too. It had been a gift from Adrian, but he'd only been 4. His mum had bought it for him to give it to her. The necklace alone brought back so many memories, because a week after he gave it to her, his mum had been in an accident, and Adrian was pulled off the school register, and he didn't see Marinette for years, and when they were reunited, it wasn't long before they became the city's heroes. And of course, she went by Ladybug. The necklace reminded Adrian of good things, happy memories, but also terrible ones. He couldn't bear to be around her despite how much he loved her. He finally reached the bottom of the blood-soaked stair and advanced through the metro station towards the platform, only to find homeless people curled up against the walls everywhere. While homelessness wasn't new in any city, it shouldn't be on this scale. They were all wrapped in blankets, but Adrian could see each person's cheekbones and their sunken eye sockets. He felt himself get angry. Why wasn't Ladybug doing anything? But he let it go. Marinette, Alia and Nino couldn't do this alone. They were only 3 people. 3 people couldn't save a city, especially not when the police were corrupt, and he certainly hadn't helped them by leaving. He would come back later though, with food and warm drinks. He went further and further into the station, trying not to notice the used syringe placed precariously on top of overflowing bins, or the way it seemed the once pristine white tile walls of the metro had been punched off in some places, the plaster below covered in dry blood. He knew it was bad. He didn't know it was this bad. He made it down to the platform, and the worst thing down there was that it smelt of urine, and that everyone was staring at him. But he could handle that. The train arrived and he stood up, clinging to a hanging strap on board, pretending he couldn't hear the entire carriage whispering about him. He wished his headphones weren't at the bottom of his bag. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a girl about his age approach him. She glared at him, and when she was close enough, she spat at his feet. "You're not welcome here," she said, her voice almost a hiss. "I am not like my father," Adrian said, sure his knuckles had gone white where he was gripping the hanging strap. Her glare got worse. "We all know you are." Thankfully, she got off at the next stop, and Adrian kept his face turned to the floor. Difficult didn't mean impossible, he told himself. He could do this. The therapist was right. Being back would help. Hopefully. And he was getting better at separating his memories out. Thoughts of Marinette were forever entwined with the reveal of who his father was. But not all of them. He had to focus on those ones, the only things that had kept him happy while he'd been in Nice. He didn't want his first reaction when he saw her again to burst into tears because he still didn't have a hold on his nightmares after 3 years. The metro train arrived at his stop, and once he'd grabbed his bags, he got off, this station in a much better shape compared to the one at the Gare de Lyon. He made his way up to the surface and took a moment as he stared up at the high gates of the Agreste mansion. He hadn't seen it in so long. And while he didn't want to go inside, to a place that was full of memories of his father, he had no choice. He walked over to the gates and took his key out of his pocket to unlock them. He stepped into the small courtyard, and just as he was locking them behind him, he heard the mansion's front door open and close. "Adrian?" The blonde man turned around and smiled when he saw Natalie, and she jogged down the steps towards him. She was the only one he'd kept in contact with so they could keep running Gabriel, and while they FaceTimed every week, it wasn't the same as seeing her in person. He hadn't noticed over their video calls that her hair was starting to go grey at the temples. The two of them hugged, Adrian towering over her now. She had been the one to tutor him for all those years he had been homeschooled. He used to be tiny in comparison to her. "How was the journey?" she asked when she pulled away. "Good," Adrian said, the lie coming easily. He'd thrown up halfway through the ride in the train's bathroom. "I could have travelled for your graduation." Adrian shook his head. "It's fine. I didn't want the fuss." That wasn't a lie. He didn't want the humiliation of his name being read out as he walked across the university stage and the room to be filled with whispers instead of applause. He'd opted for his degree certification to be sent in the post. "Well, even so, I'm proud of you. Top of the class couldn't have come easy." He smiled. It had, actually. No one wanted anything to do with him. The only thing he could do was study. It's no problem. Anything for the business. He couldn't say the name of the fashion brand out loud. They should change it if they weren't going to dissolve it. "A business degree will help. Have you seen any of your friends yet?" Adrian shook his head. As far as he was aware, no one but Natalie knew he was back, and he wasn't sure if anyone wanted to know he was. But he was here, and he was here to stay. He may as well bite the bullet and try and find Marinette. "No, but I'm going to now. Could you take my bags in? I'll be back later." Natalie eyed the duffel on the ground, as well as a small suitcase. "Of course. I'll see you later. Dinner's at 6. Adrian nodded, and after giving Natalie a kiss on the cheek, he went back into the metro. His ride was largely the same as his one from the Gare de Lyon, sans the spitting, and when he stepped out into the fresh air, he stared at his old high school for a moment. Francois Dupont. It had been a while since he'd seen it. They'd barely graduated before he and Marinette had found out his father was Hawkmoth. The school's windows were all boarded up now, and the door had been nailed shut. Crude graffiti in purple splattered across the front. It had faded now, and it was difficult to read, but Adrian got the message. Vandals had found out this had been the school Hawkmoth's son had attended, and they had made it clear he wasn't welcome back in Paris. And after the way that girl had acted towards him on the train, it was clear the general consensus held by Parisians was that he was still not wanted here. He took a deep breath, then crossed the road towards the school, but headed down the left side of it, where the outside maintenance access was for the boiler room. Unlike the main entrance to the school, this one was still in good shape, reinforced metal, and with a biometric lock installed on the underside of the handle so no one would notice it when they walked past. He wrapped his right hand around it and pressed his index finger to the cool interface, and listened for the quiet click that indicated the door was open, but it didn't. His access had been denied. He tried not to feel too hurt. It had been 3 years, and he hadn't said a word to any of them. It made sense for them to remove his details. With a sigh, he turned around, tears immediately springing to his eyes. The bakery was right there, across the road from the school like it had always been. But the shutters on every single floor were down. The bakery was clearly closed for good. At least it hadn't been covered in graffiti, though. But even so, the golden lettering of the signs always used to gleam, no matter the weather. The sun was peeking over the grey clouds, but its light didn't reach the bakery. It seemed dead. It was heartbreaking to see, and even worse, looming behind it, was the scaffolding structure for the oxygen tower in the park. They tried so hard to stop it from happening. Luca, Milen, Ivan, Rose, all of them. And it was still happening. Where were all of his friends now? They probably hated him too. But perhaps he could talk to Felix and Kagami. They lived together in London now. Maybe his cousin's fiancée could shed some light on why the tower was still going ahead. The door behind him opened, and Adrian turned around, hoping to see Marinette. But it wasn't. It was Alia. And thankfully, she was smiling at him. "Adrian Agreste," she said. "Alia Césaire?" She opened her arms. "Come here." He quickly closed the distance between them, and even though Alia was smaller than him, it was like he fell into her arms. He'd only met Alia when he was 16, but she was incredible. He had missed her. He pulled away when he felt the beginning of him crying, and saw Alia had tears in her eyes too. "I missed you," she said. "I missed you too." "Come on, before anyone sees us," she said, pulling him inside the hero's headquarters. But her warning wasn't needed. Now the school had been shut down, and so had the bakery. There was no one around. This part of Paris felt like a ghost town. The door shut behind him, and Adrian managed a smile when he saw that their old hideout in the boiler room hadn't changed much. It had started out as a convenience. Master Fu was the caretaker at their school, so it made sense that they used the boiler room, even if it was a little small and cumbersome of an area because of all the piping. But the familiar blue glow of it comforted Adrian. Alia led him through to where their desks were, and he stopped a moment to stare at his. After that final fight, he dropped his Cat Noir costume off, and then he'd gone home to pack his bags and head to the hotel to try and make peace with what had happened. He hadn't bothered coming here again, and now his belongings were covered in dust. His schoolbooks, a snow globe of Shanghai, and a framed photo of him and Marinette. He turned to her desk. It had changed. It wasn't as cluttered as it once was, but there was still a pile of... well, Adrian wasn't sure what it was. "What are these?" he asked, and Alia turned to see where he was looking. "Oh, just some prototypes. Mr. Cubdell is always coming up with new gadgets for us." It was nice to know he was still helping them. "How is he?" "He's good." "And Alex?" Adrian asked. "Also good, as far as I'm aware. She's in Egypt." "You haven't spoken to her?" Adrian shook his head and Alia sighed, sitting down at her desk. "Adrian, I'm happy to see you. Truly, I am. But not everyone else will be." He nodded. He already knew that. He kept staring at Marinette's desk, though, and frowned when he saw her framed photo of the two of them together had gone. But she wouldn't keep it up. He knew that. "Marinette was here about an hour ago." He looked back over at Alia. "How is she?" "Not good. She heard you were back." Adrian bit his lip. "What did she say?" "She had a panic attack." The blonde man sighed and sat down on the edge of Nino's desk. "I'm a horrible person." "Yes, you can be." Adrian raised an eyebrow. He hadn't expected Alia to say that. "Like I said, I'm glad to see you again. But you can't come back and pretend nothing happened. You hurt a lot of people. Marinette, Nino. They won't be as happy as me." Adrian nodded. His mind had been largely focused on his girlfriend. His ex-girlfriend, he reminded himself. He wasn't under any delusion that they were still dating after ghosting her for 3 years. But of course, Nino, his best friend, would be hurt too. Especially after what happened with Chris. "I know," he said. "Why are you back?" Alia asked, then reached for a bobble to tie up her hair. It had got even longer, but otherwise she still looked the same. He'd had his hair cut, short on the back and sides, leaving the volume on top. "For closure, my therapist thought it would be good. And to work." "You're back for good then?" "Yeah," he said, and then bit his lip. "I know I have no right to ask, or to even hope, but Marinette, has she been with anyone else?" "No," Alia said. "Are you sure?" "Yes. There was nobody else. But whether she would give you another chance..." "I know she won't." Alia shrugged. "You never know. I'm pretty sure she's still in love with you." Adrian felt his heartbeat speed up, but he ignored it. He couldn't hope for something like that. Not when he'd also just been told the thought of him had given Marinette a panic attack. "You still love her, don't you?" Alia asked. "I thought about her every single day." Alia sighed. "Why didn't you call?" Adrian shook his head. "I couldn't. All of this," he said, gesturing to the desks, his eyes lingering on Marinette's Ladybug costume hanging on the wall, "reminds me of my father. I still get nightmares." Alia came over and sat next to him on the edge of the desk. "We all do. But we could have helped each other, Adrian. Marinette was devastated when you left. She didn't talk for a week. He knew when he'd left that he'd hurt her. But he didn't expect this." "Where is she now?" "She's at work." "Where does she live?" "At the bakery," Alia said. Well, no longer a bakery. Her parents left. But she bought it from them. "Wow," Alia smiled. "That's our girl. Amazing both as Marinette and Ladybug. Has the superhero stuff been going okay?" She sighed. "I guess. The 3 of us go out every night. We try to help. But there's just so much. It's like the city is rotting." Adrian nodded. Rotting was a good way to describe the state of Paris. "I saw a lot of homeless people in the metro." Alia nodded. "Yeah, it's warm in there. And thankfully the police are too busy getting bribed by gangs to move them along. But we don't have the resources to feed them all every night." "Maybe I could help with that?" Adrian asked, and she smiled. "Money would help, but we need the people to distribute it. Food banks don't work. The gangs always burn them down." "It's fine. We'll figure something out. Sadly though, I've got to get back to work." She made her way back over to her desk and sat down, and Adrian finally saw the Ladybug on her computer screen. "You still run that?" "Yep." And I get paid now, although not loads, just from the site advertisers, but it's okay. Nino and I live here rent-free. No one wants this place. Can I take a look around? Sure, Alia said, turning away from her computer. Just don't go in Mr. Damocles' office. That's where Nino and I live. Of course. He left the boiler room then, using the entrance that was inside the school, and came out into the courtyard of DuPont. Now they didn't have to pack away the training equipment each night. Adrian saw that they'd left it all out. The climbing frames, the targets stuck to the walls, the silks dangling from the roof that Marinette practiced her gymnastics on. He walked over to them, twisting the worn red fabric in his hands. They spent hours in here after school, training together so they wouldn't get hurt. As he glanced around the courtyard, it was like he could see phantoms of the 16-year-old versions of him, Marinette, Alia, and Nino, along with Master Fu, and he had to sit down for a moment on the ground. As difficult being a hero had been sometimes, he'd missed this, helping people with his two best friends and the girl he loved. He made his way upstairs and pushed open the door to their old classroom. It would be nice to see it again, and it was largely the same as the last time he'd been in here, with the desks going up the stairs, which were now all covered in dust. Except for one, his. It had been cleaned, and recently, judging by the depth of filth on Nino's side of the table, and placed on top of it was the framed photo of him and Marinette that used to be on her desk downstairs. And beside it was a vase, full of fresh red roses. He took one out, noting that all of the thorns had been snapped off. A red rose meant love, and with the amount of care Marinette had put into maintaining this space, and recent care too, since the flowers were still alive, had to mean she still felt something for him. Right? That was assuming Marinette had done all of this in the first place, but Adrian doubted Alia or Nino had. With a smile, he replaced the rose, then went back to the boiler room. It was a while until dinner, but he needed to unpack. Not that he had much. It was mainly clothes and a few books. He got rid of all the fencing trophies not long after he'd arrived in Nice. After saying goodbye to Alia, who had also re-added his fingerprint to the biometric database while he was upstairs, he got the metro back home. His journey was filled with stares and whispers again, but he ignored it. He was moving back to Paris. He had to learn to deal with it. As soon as he left the metro, though, he saw something he wasn't prepared for. The press had arrived, and they were all crowded at the gates of the mansion. He stood at the top of the metro station steps and sighed. They really needed a back entrance to the house, and if he still had his Cat Noir baton, he could have made it over the garden wall. But he didn't, so he was going to have to brave this. He took a deep breath and approached the mansion, gently pushing his way through the photographers, and he managed to get halfway through the crowd before someone realised it was him. "He's here! It's Adrian Agreste!" He started being shoved around as the cameras flashed, but he kept his head down and took his keys out of his pocket. "He's got a knife!" someone screamed, and Adrian flinched as everyone shrieked, but they immediately dispersed. If they were so intent in their belief that he was no better than his father, why were they all coming anywhere near him? If he believed someone was a murderer, he'd avoid them at all costs. Thankfully, it gave him the chance to unlock the gates and slip inside, and by then, the rest of the reporters realised it had only been a key, not a knife, but he'd already managed to lock them out. Even so, they all pressed themselves to the bars, cameras shoved through the gaps, but Adrian kept going, up the stairs and in through the front door. Natalie was waiting in the hall. "I really wish you hadn't fired your bodyguard," she said, "and I wish my dad hadn't poisoned half of the city." As he said it, he glanced up at the stairs, and thankfully, Natalie had got rid of that portrait of him and Gabriel. Good riddance. "What's for dinner?" he asked. "Dinner is cancelled," she said, in full assistant mode now. "You've been invited to a gala." Adrian sighed and put his hands in his coat pockets. "I really don't feel like going to some posh person's party on my first night back in Paris. Of course, you don't have to, but it will be good for your image, and I thought you'd be interested. It's at Montparnasse Tower, for Ada." He sighed. Max's mum's company, where Max also worked. He and Adrian had never been super close, but they had been friends. How would he react to seeing him again? He bit his lip. Perhaps it wouldn't be so bad. Alia's reaction had been largely positive, but who else would be there that he knew? Would he be ready for their rejection? "I don't know, Natalie," he said, turning to go upstairs. "Marinette will also be there." He froze, then spun back to her. "Please RSVP for me." "I already did." He smiled. "Thanks, Natalie." She could read him like a book. He carried on walking, and made it halfway up the stairs to his childhood bedroom before he turned back and called out to Natalie. Was her response. The day I left. How did she react? Natalie had mentioned on their FaceTime call that week, the first of many, that Marinette had come over on the day he'd left looking for him, but he hadn't allowed Natalie to tell him any more. Hearing about her would have broken his resolve, and he would have been back in Paris before the end of the day. Marinette? Well, she was sad. Very sad. She didn't believe me. She thought I was lying. So she forced her way inside and went to your room. When I found her, she was cuddling one of your pillows. She was having a panic attack on your bed. Adrian looked down at the floor. She'd had a panic attack then, on the day he left, and another one today, when he got back. Maybe seeing her tonight wouldn't be a good idea, but he had to apologise. And maybe it would be selfish of him, in case she did have another panic attack, but he would be there for her. He wouldn't leave her. Not again. Thanks, Natalie, he mumbled, then went along to his bedroom. It was just as he left it, just the bare bones of the furniture. It had been dusted, though, and Natalie had changed the bedding, probably in anticipation of his arrival. She had left his bags beside the bed, and he hauled them up onto it so he could unpack, but he found himself staring at the pillows. Marinette had been here. Granted, it had been 3 years ago, but even so. As he kept staring at the bed, it felt like he could hear her sobbing, not to mention the last time he'd slept in this bed. It had been before he found out what his father had done. Adrian had known Gabriel had never been the best dad. After his mum's accident, Gabriel had neglected him, passing all child-rearing duties to Natalie. But being a bad dad didn't mean Gabriel was a bad person. But all along, he turned out to be both. Adrian didn't want to be in here, or at least not on his own, anyway. He went over to the television and put it on, and it landed on the news. Nadia, we can't keep glossing over these issues, Alec told the other presenter, and Adrian found himself smiling. It had been a while since he'd heard their voices. Nadia shot her co-presenter a fake smile. The police are trying their best. Alec looked exasperated. Their best? Their best is taking bribes so gangs can traffic children. You can't be serious, Nadia. With a sigh, Adrian changed the channel. He was ashamed of himself. All of this crime, yet he had spent 3 years away, being willingly oblivious to it all. Now he was back, he needed to help in any way he could.